Chapter 23 covers the Progressive Era, and so the goal of this presentation is to give you a quick look at who the Progressives were and what exactly it was that they wanted. Question 1. How did the Progressive Movement begin, and what were some of its main goals? Okay, so the origins of the Progressive Movement are actually come during the Gilded Age. That's a part of that weird little time when we were talking about what was the Gilded Age, when was it, when did it end? Did it end in 1890? Did it end in 1895? Basically, the Gilded Age ends with the beginning of the Progressive Era. And so the Progressive Era, sometimes you see it dated as beginning in 1890 or maybe even 1895, depending on what it was people were reacting to. People generally saw, the Progressives generally saw something within society that was corrupt or something that they saw as evil. And so these evils were things that they wanted to correct. And they're not necessarily evil in the traditional sense of, something immoral and wrong. Occasionally it was. They saw evils in political corruption. Obviously that's wrong. They also saw economic corruption. Businesses taking advantage not only of the consumers, but also taking advantage of the workers. But then they also saw some inequalities as being evil. Okay? People living in poverty and kind of trapped in a cycle of poverty, and they decided that that needed to be fixed too, that was an evil they should fix. Okay? These two girls right here, these are actually young girls. They are Jewish immigrants, and if you can see here, the little banner she's wearing, it's written in a foreign language that is going to be Yiddish, which is a Jewish dialect. And over here you have the English translation that she's wearing. And you see it says abolish, and you've got to look right here on the shoulder. It says child, it wraps around her shoulder there. Abolish child slavery. So they're also seeing children having to work as a form of economic and social corruption. Now, some of the movements that pick up a lot of steam during the Progressive Era, they actually had a longer history than just, say, the 1890s. There was the Temperance Movement. Temperance means moderation in alcohol. The Temperance Movement actually began in the United States in the 1820s, 1830s with the Second Great Awakening, as a lot of Christians saw that as kind of one of the evils that God did not want to exist. Well, during the Gilded Age, a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, they formed, and they had as their goal not just moderation in alcohol, but also restrictions and ultimately limiting the consumption of alcohol and preventing it. You also had an increase in drive for the women's rights movement. Well, we all know that that began in the 1800s. If you don't want to go all the way back to Abigail Addams with her Remember the Ladies, you can go back to 1848 in the Seneca Falls Convention, where a group of women actually called for the right to vote. And so that had been kind of the big thing that had been going on in the 1800s. By the time you got to the 1890s, the suffrage movement really was kind of the driving force of that women's rights movement. And so you had a group called the American Women's Suffrage Association, which formed during the Gilded Age, and their goal was to get the right to vote. There's also another group called the National Women's Suffrage Association, so you had two groups of women who were working for the same goal. Other movements existed that existed before the Gilded Age came along. There was the abolition movement that led to eventually the civil rights movement. There's also a movement for Native American rights. You also had the populist movement, which actually was a big influence on the progressives. The populists, we may say that they died out before the Progressive Era, but they did influence the progressives. So, who were these progressives? Who were the progressives? What exactly were they? The people who were leaders in the movement were actually mostly middle class. Okay? They're trying to change the system, so you don't have a lot of upper class people that are heavily involved in this and heavily invested in it because the system's been good to them. They like the system. Generally, the leaders had some college education. They had a little bit better jobs, which not only provided them more income, it also provided them with more free time and gave them the opportunity to kind of work outside of work. Unlike some other movements, the progressive movement also had a larger percentage of women who were working in this. During the progressive era, during the Gilded Age, the progressive era, to have a middle-class job kind of allowed the family to have, one parent working while the other parent was able to stay at home. So you're talking about a father working while mom stayed at home. You could have a good middle-class lifestyle with only one adult working. Well, these women, they're going to do the same things we think of as women in the home today. They're going to take care of the home. They're going to take care of the kids. But at some point, those kids go to school. And at some point, they are in the house with no one to take care of. And so the progressive movement was a way that they could take care of other people within society. Now, a lot of the progressive movements are actually focused in the Northeast and then the North from the Civil War. Don't think that you're going to have a whole lot of people up in like North Dakota doing this thing. But the Civil War North and the Northeast is where you would find most of these people. You're not going to find a lot of progressives in the South because they want to change social inequalities. In the South, we were kind of happy with social inequality. We liked it. It's important to remember the progressives were not a political party. They're not like the populists. The populists went out and they formed a political party. The progressives did not. Being a progressive was a way of thinking. You wanted progress. You wanted change. You wanted to fix things. And because of that, progressives come from all political parties. Right? They come from the Republican Party, they come from the Democrat Party, they also come from the smaller third parties. But if you wanted change, if you wanted to fix what you saw as an evil, you could consider yourself to be a progressive. Now, the overall goals of the progressives, what it was that they kind of wanted to do, I've said this several times already, they wanted to reform or fix the system. Okay? They don't want to overthrow the system. They don't want to overthrow capitalism. They just want to find the inequalities that exist within it and fix those. They also wanted to correct the abuses that they saw within society. Okay? That's going to be where your temperance movement comes in. Okay? Alcohol leads to is abusing people, whether it's through the directly abusing the people who are alcoholics or indirectly abusing people who are their victims, whether it's victims of violence or victims of the fact that they're just spending money on alcohol, not spending it on things they should be. Some of the specific goals that the progressives had were to make government more accountable to the people. One of the characteristics of people who are interested in progressive democracy is that they believed more democracy would help cure society's problems. If you got the people more involved, if the people were more invested, then that would help cure society's problems. So they also wanted to, therefore, increase participation in democracy. Well, what are some of the ways you do that? Well, number one, half of the country cannot vote. And so one of the things you could do is open up the vote to women. They also wanted to give the government more power. The idea was if the government had more power, it could more easily protect the rights of the people and protect the interests of the people, whether it's through breaking up trusts, guaranteeing people's rights, or whatever. And they also wanted to correct the social injustices that they saw. So the early civil rights movement will be a progressive movement. We don't think of the civil rights movement until we get to maybe the 1950s, but it is going on before then. It's just not something that we typically think of, but we do need to remember that it was. Now, those goals are going to be different for every person, and they're going to be different in different locations. And so, there is no real one true progressive goal. there were progressives who said, we want to strengthen the government so it can protect against the evil trusts. And at the same time, they supported inequality among the races. So being a progressive in one area does not necessarily mean you're a progressive in all areas. Question number 2. Based on the cartoon, what does the artist believe about women reformers? We're going to go ahead and blow the cartoon up here a little bit. Just in case you can't read these, depending on what size screen you've got down here, I'll go down to the bottom, the caption. That would actually be the title here. A woman's work is never done. And so we have our woman out here. She's hanging laundry. Around her waist is tied an apron that says Mother America. And the laundry that she has been working so hard, she's been doing her reconstruction work, and she's been scrubbing it with advancement soap and legislation, and she has now finished and is hanging up industrial freedom, equal pay, the 8-hour day, child labor laws, universal suffrage. There's a minimum wage back here, health insurance, and there's a cute little one, playgrounds. Question number 3. Who were major progressive reformers, and what issues did they focus on? And here I'm just asking you to kind of make a list. List the person, list their issue. Okay, so some of the early progressives, a lot of the social reformers. There's a lady named Jane Addams, and a lot of people kind of date the beginning of the progressive movement with her. In 1889, she founded this organization called Hull House. Hull House it's still there, it's located in Chicago, and what it was, Hull House was a settlement house. Settlement house, the purpose of a settlement house is to provide help to the poor. And not just to provide help to the poor, but also to do it in their neighborhood. So that building would have been located within a poor neighborhood. It would have been across the street from a tenement building. It would have been across the street from a factory. Okay. These things start springing up across the United States, modeled on what Jane Addams has done. And she actually got her information from the settlement houses that were being formed in Britain at the time. But they would provide things like a hot lunch. They would provide basic medical care. A lot of the people who worked in the settlement houses were middle-class women. Again, these were women who their husbands had jobs that were able to take care of the family. She does not have to work, but she still is looking for something to do and looking to use that motherly instinct. Another social reformer is a guy named John Dewey. John Dewey is an education reformer. He wrote a book called Democracy in Education. And basically what John Dewey said was that in terms of education, he said we're doing it wrong. Now, the typical way we taught kids was kind of the way we still teach kids. We put them in desks and the professor talks, the teacher talks, and the kids are expected to repeat what they're taught. They're not taught to investigate. They're not taught to think critically. And so John Dewey said children need to learn by doing. And so the idea was you give the kids some information and then have them go do something, and then evaluate whether or not they had learned. Civil rights reformers, you do have a lot of African Americans involved in this. There was a movement in the early 1900s called the Niagara Movement. One of the leaders of the Niagara Movement was a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois. We kind of mentioned him during the Gilded Age, one of the leaders of the African American early civil rights movement. He was for integration, and there he is. The Niagara Movement started after a race riot in 1908. The race riot took place in Springfield, Illinois, and there had been race riots before. Okay, there had been race riots in the United States since the Civil War, and so to the idea that, oh, there's another race riot, that's not necessarily shocking. What was shocking was the fact it was in Springfield, Illinois, which was the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. and you had a lot of people who were interested in African American civil rights that all of a sudden went, okay, this has got to stop. And so they met at Niagara Falls, and they actually started out in New York, and because of a segregated hotel, they moved across the river into Canada. And they wrote this thing called the Declaration of Principles, where they called for an end to segregation. They called for the guarantee of the right to vote for all African American men all around the country, equal justice and equal opportunities. Eventually, that Niagara Movement, the next year, is going to advance, and they're going to create their own organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right? Or the NAACP, which obviously is still around. Okay. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had as its goal the end of all segregation. So it was actually an interracial organization. It had several people who helped form this. Its main goal was to challenge segregation through the courts. So it's going to start suing people. It started suing people and would kind of build up court cases until eventually in the 1950s it was able to successfully challenge in Brown versus Board the idea that segregation is inherently unequal. W.B. Du Bois would be one of the leaders, but he would also be an editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. And he had several of these people who were very influential in the first probably 30 years of the civil right of the NAACP. You have W.B. Du Bois, but then you also had a guy named William English Walling, and you can take a look at some of these folks as we're putting them up here. This is Mary White Ovington. This is James Weldon Johnson. He would be become president in the 19-teens. Okay. Oswald Garrison Villiard. This is Henry Moskowitz. Ida B. Wells Barnett. And then the last one is Joel Spingarn. And several of these people have awards that the NAACP still gives in their name. And the great thing that I love about these photographs is this was an interracial organization. Okay? So you had whites and blacks working together. Moskowitz is even Jewish. And so you have all these people saying, look, equal rights is important, not just for our group, but for other groups as well. You also have political reformers who were involved in the progressive movement. One of the earliest and well-known political reformers is a guy named Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette was the governor of Wisconsin. He was elected during the Gilded Age. He's a Republican, and he was kind of the first nationwide known politician who was a progressive. As governor of Wisconsin, he kind of dedicated his governor's term to turning Wisconsin into what they called the laboratory of democracy. They started experimenting with how could they make the government more democratic and more responsive to the people. One of the things they did was he appointed experts to government positions. If you needed a state secretary of education, for example, he would appoint a teacher or a professor of education, somebody who knew and dealt with the subject on a regular basis. He wouldn't appoint somebody that just necessarily donated to his campaign. They would also use new tools to kind of increase democracy. Some of those were these things right here. The initiative. Initiative is where the people can propose a law and kind of force the legislature to vote on it. There's referendum, where the legislature passes a bill, but before it can become law, the people get to vote on it, and if the people vote against it, it does not become law. They also introduced this thing called recall. Recall is where the voters can remove a politician from office before his term is up. If we elected someone to office and then decided they were corrupt, we're not stuck with them. We could actually remove them. They also introduced the Australian ballot. That would be the secret ballot. where you get a ballot, you go into the voting booth, and no one gets to see exactly who you vote for. And then they would also introduce this thing called the direct primary. The direct primary is where the individual members of a political party got to vote in what we call primaries and help choose the national politicians that would run for office in the general elections, which we have in November. Another politician is a guy named Hiram Johnson. He was governor out in California. And there's going to be another guy named Charles Evans Hughes. He was governor in New York and would later also be on the Supreme Court. You also have a group of progressives that are called the muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists. And we've just gotten through with imperialism, where we talked about another group of journalists, the yellow journalists. You need to know the difference between yellow journalists and muckrakers, because they're actually in existence at the same time. Muckrakers are the ones today we would call investigative journalists. They were actually looking for the corruption, looking for the evils, pointing out the problems in society, and then turning around and calling for change. Several different muckrakers. Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell, here she is. She investigated Standard Oil and kind of what it was that John D. Rockefeller did. How exactly did he gain control over the industry, and found out that he used unfair business practices, things that today are illegal, but weren't necessarily illegal during the Gilded Age. Another guy named Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities, where he went through and he investigated the poor and the poverty that existed in the cities. You know, how can we have such splendor in terms of Rockefeller and Carnegie and those guys, and at the same time allow such squalor to exist within the cities? Ida B. Wells, we've talked about her as being a leader in the NAACP. She was still investigating lynchings. She's still writing about lynchings. She's exposing that evil, and so she is also a muckraker. Another guy's named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis wasn't a writer. Jacob Riis was a photographer. And so he did a lot of photojournalism, and he also investigated corruption within poverty, and took pictures to kind of debunk social Darwinism. He would take pictures of kids living on the street. Social Darwinism says that they're going to grow up to be poor because something in their nature makes them poor. And his photographs would show you they're six, and we've set them up to where they don't have any chance. Is this really their fault? Another muckraker, and we'll talk more about him later, is a guy named Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair, he was a socialist, and he wanted to prove that socialism was a good thing, and so he would try to expose the evils of capitalism. Inadvertently, he would also expose some of the business practices that were going on that just weren't healthy. Question number 4. How did the progressives impact the United States? So, the impact of the progressives overall, the movement lasted until 1920. That is a firm date. No one argues about that one. 1920 is when the progressive movement ended. They were able, in the roughly 20 to 30 years they were around, to get 4 amendments added to the Constitution. We call these the Progressive Amendments. The 16th Amendment created the income tax, where the government is going to take a portion of everyone's income and use that to exercise its abilities to control business, to enact laws, to legislate things, but also to protect the public interests, the progressives thought. That 16th Amendment, that income tax, only applied when it was originally passed. It only applied to anyone who made over $6,000 a year, which was something really pathetically small, like 1% of the population. They added the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators, where the people of each individual state get to elect the 2 senators that go to Washington and represent that state, thus making the Senate more responsive to the people of the states they represent. They also added the 18th Amendment, prohibition, the ban on the sale, manufacture, transportation, and possession of alcohol within the United States. This was their plan to eliminate public drunkenness and anything else that they felt its root cause was actually alcohol. Then they also added the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, women's right to vote. And of these 4 amendments, 3 of them are actually still in existence. The 18th Amendment was taken away by the 21st, but that would be about a decade or so later. As a result of the 19th Amendment, there was a group that formed called the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters, they actually go out and they investigate the candidates during each election. They actually put together a really good, what we call a bipartisan newsletter. They don't swing for one candidate or the other. They just present you with the facts, and here are the candidates. Make your choice. The Progressives also expanded the power of the presidency, and they expanded the power of the national government to be able to regulate the economy, to be able to regulate society, kind of correcting those social abuses that they thought only government could do. They had a lot of legislative success also. There are a lot of important laws that come out of this time period that really form the basis of what we think of today as government laws and regulations. We're not so much adding new ones as we are just expanding on the ones that the Progressives